Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jordanna Gessler, Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you for joining us for our monthly series that takes you into our archive for a behind the scenes look at some of the most fascinating artifacts in our collection. With me today is Christie, the museum's collection manager. Together we will be showing you the museum's unique and fascinating collection of art by Holocaust survivor Erich Lichtblau-Leskly. The collection juxtaposes the original pieces of art from Lichtblau-Leskly's Theresienstadt period with his reproduced versions that he created later in life after surviving and while living in Israel. The later works feature additional detail, brighter colors, and added writings that give further insight into the subject matter the artist was attempting to convey, his memories, his reflections. To have both the artist and art survive the Holocaust is quite rare. And the insights Leskly gives us, both during and after the Holocaust, demonstrate the true meaning of spiritual resistance. Christie is joining us live from our archive, where we will show you and discuss some of our favorite pieces and themes. Please, if you're joining us and you have a question, we're excited to answer it, and place it in the Q&A rather than the chat on Zoom. This just allows us easier access and to ensure that we don't miss any of the questions. So now I'm going to share some of our PowerPoint presentation. Let me get it up, and then we can get started. So hi, Christie.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us today. So excited to have you inside the archive. I can already see that you have some of the prints lined up for us to see.
Yes.
But I think before we take a look at the artwork, we should really take a behind the scenes look at the collection by looking at the historical context. Before we get into that, for those who were unable to join us in our last presentation of Inside the Acid-Free Box, I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about the rich archival collection that we house at Holocaust Museum LA.
Of course. So we have approximately 20,000 artifacts and documents within the collection of the museum, and around about 610 collections and sub-collections surrounding that. And so many of those collections relate to a particular person or family and have been donated as a family collection, perhaps, and include materials such as photographs, documents, letters, obviously artwork, which is what we're going to discuss today, textiles, family heirlooms, and then testimony from some of the survivors in our community. So like Jordanna mentioned, the Leskly collection is made up of artwork that was created during the artist's time while he was imprisoned in Theresienstadt, and then also with larger scale reproductions of those pieces that he created later in life when living in Israel. And so it's a very unique part of our collection. Obviously, because as Jordanna was saying, it's extremely rare to have artwork that was actually created in the ghetto or camps and managed to survive the war and then really become a testimony for us in terms of a visual testimony, which is definitely something that is rare and that you don't see very often.
And I know that you're in our State of the Art archive, but where is the archive located?
So it's behind me. So you might be able to see some of the shelving behind me. So I am sitting in the archive room at the moment, and it is within the museum building upstairs in our office. And then all of the shelving behind me is what holds the museum's collection, in addition to what is obviously on display within our core exhibit within the galleries downstairs.
And can anyone just walk into the archive?
No, it is definitely a controlled area. So you need to have a security pass and be a staff member to be able to access the room.
So before we dive in, I also just want to point out that this session of Inside the Acid-Free Box is dealing with artwork. And artwork is meant to represent different themes and resonate in different ways with the viewer. So some of the insights Christie and I have are mostly based on the writings of Leskly himself, as he did survive the Holocaust. But you at home can have a completely different understanding of the piece. And I encourage everyone to be thinking analytically and sort of when looking at the artwork, how does it make you feel? What do you think the intention of the art piece is? How does it resonate with you? What do you think it's telling you? And I think a great example of this is the art piece we're looking at on screen right now. So the smaller fragment was created by Leskly in Theresienstadt, and then the larger painting that has more vibrant colors and words he created afterwards in Israel. And so as we go through the artwork, you'll notice this. So if a picture doesn't seem quite as colorful or looks like it's been taped together, as you can actually see in the one of the pictures here. Here, let me see if I can annotate it really quickly. So there's this sort of tape right here. That's actually because the artwork was ripped in two. And that, if you see an artwork that looks like that, that came from Theresienstadt, whereas if you see a more complete drawing or illustration or painting, that is from his Israel period. And this piece resonates to me in a different way than Leskly actually intended. When I look at the image of these yellow Jewish stars that the Jews of Europe were forced to wear to identify them by the Nazis, underneath these sort of traditional garb from different countries throughout Europe, to me it says that this is just one layer of somebody's identity, and people can have different layers to their identity. They can be Jewish, they can be German, they can be a woman, they could be a mother, a daughter, a sister. And I think that Leskly is trying to tell us that although the Nazis worked to isolate groups by identifying them by one characteristic, people are layers, and there's much more complexity to who they are. Leskly later tells us, after creating and finishing the piece in Israel, that he was also trying to point to the fact that the Nazis targeted people who they themselves did not consider themselves Jewish, which is why you see in the later Israel piece the depiction of a nun whose head is a yellow Jewish star. The fact that the Nazis took a religion and claimed it as a so-called race and targeted people who they themselves did not identify as Jewish. But I think this is a great example of how art speaks differently to different people. So definitely take take what we're saying at face value and dive deeply into yourself. So now we'll go to the next, oops, I was still annotating. Now we will go to the next slide, which is pre-war life in Czechoslovakia. And I'm just seeing here if we, Christie, are you still with us? I want to make sure that the internet is strong. So everyone just bear with me for one moment before we continue. Okay, so it seems that we've lost Christie, which is totally okay. She will come back soon, I'm sure. I'm going to continue and sort of tell you all a little bit of pre-war life in Czechoslovakia. Here on your screen, you can see a picture of our artist, Erich Lichtblau-Leskly, and his wife. He was originally born on June 16th, 1911, in a small Moravian town in Czechoslovakia, which at that time when he was born was actually part of Austria-Hungary, because this is before the end of World War I, when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was dissolved and broken up. Oh, Christie's back, wonderful.
Sorry, the internet just dropped out.
You know what, I figured that you just took a quick trip to Australia and left us all here.
Yes.
I was just getting into the pre-war life in Czechoslovakia. I had mentioned that Erich was born in June of 1911. He was definitely an artist from the beginning. He worked as a store window decorator. He studied at the Hamburg School of Design. He was a professional artist. He married Elsa in March of 1937, and they relocated to Prague to escape the Nazi invasion, which took place in 1939 before the outbreak of World War II. So as many of you history buffs know, when the Nazis and the Soviet Union invaded Poland, September 1st, 1939, this was not the first land grab that the Nazis had done. They had already annexed Austria, the Sudetenland, and had in fact invaded Czechoslovakia, allowing Slovakia to be its own independent country and sort of using or annexing or ruling over the Czech parts of Czechoslovakia. And so that is where Leskly and his wife were living at that time. So so we talked a little bit about how he relocated to Prague looking for work. He worked as in construction. He was able to secure a job there. And then in 1940, they left Prague again and moved to a different part of what we now know as the Czech Republic.
Yeah, so they actually relocated to Písek in southern Bohemia because they actually joined a Zionist group, Hakshara, and we're actually doing agricultural work in Písek. And actually the photo that we're looking at on the screen right now, which is this one right here, was actually taken of them in Písek in 1940 while they were in that area. And then the photo at the bottom of the screen is actually the farm that they were working at during that time as well.
Yeah, and this was a small Zionist movement that was working to be trained in agriculture, because of course these were people who had lived in Prague and other small cities and were not used to sort of farming jobs, and they were hoping that they would be able to escape the Nazi controlled lands and resettle in the British Mandate of Palestine, which in that country there was a big need for agricultural jobs and work. And so this was their training base with the hopes that they would be able to relocate and escape the Nazis. However, this unfortunately did not come to fruition. And so the couple is deported to Theresienstadt on the 26th of November, 1942. And Elsa was assigned at Theresienstadt to work in the kitchen, while Erich was initially assigned to the construction yard and later to the graphic workshops, which was part of the technical department, which afforded him access to certain art material, which definitely helped him create, or gave him access to create, these incredible pieces that we're about to explore. I just want to share really quickly, before we get into these incredible artifacts we're looking at, a little bit about Theresienstadt for those who might have forgotten some of their historical learning or want to learn some more. So Theresienstadt was actually established by the Nazis in November of 1941. So, you know, about a year prior, before Erich and his wife are deported there. It was founded in this garrison town called Theresien, which had been named after Maria Theresia, who had been the empress of the Habsburg Empire. And it was in northwestern Czechoslovakia, again, what is now known as in the Czech Republic. Holocaust historians have described it as both a ghetto and a camp. So even in this presentation today, you might hear us call it both. And it's because it fit both of those identifications, but it was very unique because it was neither one nor the other. Day-to-day operations were run by a Jewish council. The prisoners wore civilian clothing. They were able to hold some cultural events similar to a ghetto. They were also issued currency, which we're actually going to look at in not right now, but soon. And so they had to trade in all of their actual real money and were given this sort of like fake, in a way, monopoly money. The money had absolutely no value outside of Theresienstadt. It was just another way of economic control over the Jews living in Theresienstadt. They were also forced to perform hard labor. They were enslaved. They lived in horrific conditions that were designed to accelerate their death. So in all of these ways, this is your typical characteristics of a Nazi ghetto. However, it also played a critical role as a camp in the sense that it was a transit location for Jews coming from the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and being in Prague, and being transported to Eastern Europe to be murdered. So it also worked as a transit camp in this way. Theresienstadt played a critical propaganda role for the Nazis. As we all history lovers here know, the Nazis created a really large propaganda machine in which they worked to change the minds, thoughts, ideas of all of those under their control. They controlled all media, materials that were being taught in school, materials that were presented in libraries, universities, and Theresienstadt just furthered their propaganda goals. They would oftentimes hide their real intention when they deported Jews to Eastern Europe, which was murder. And instead, they would oftentimes say that Jews were being resettled for forced labor or for work or for the war effort. The Nazis used the word evacuation. But to counter the skepticism surrounding the resettlement of people who were not capable of physical labor, so older German and Austrian Jews, for example, the Nazis claimed that they were being deported to a spa town or a retirement community. And I'm using air quotes because it wasn't either of those things. It was Theresienstadt. And additionally, any sort of German or Austrian Jew who is considered to be well known in the community, so German Jews who had served during World War I for Germany, or those who were older, people with disabilities, very famous Czech Jews who were musicians and artists and well known throughout the world, in fact. These were all people who were sent to this spa town, which was really Theresienstadt. So it was a camp that was used for intense deception. So that was just a little bit about the history of Theresienstadt to refresh everyone's notes. And of course, despite the atrocities and dehumanizing conditions, cultural activities flourished at Theresienstadt. Those musicians, those artists, those composers I mentioned, they smuggled with them art supplies, music sheets. They networked to find instruments. They taught their fellow prisoners art and music. They held operas. They held play performances. And of course, they created art. So I'll now turn it over to Christie, who will tell us a little bit about the documents that we're looking at here.
Yeah, so we are looking at copies of both Erich Else's ghetto documents. So you can actually see, obviously, there is pictures of them, and it might be a little bit hard to see, but there is also in the middle, there's a stamp that basically actually gives you the date that they arrived in the ghetto. And yeah, so we actually don't have these original documents. They are still with the family, but we fortunately are able to have copies of them so we can look at it today. And yeah, there's the date there that actually shows on both of their cards of when they arrived in.
So here are some of the artifacts. So in our collection, of course, we don't just have the artworks of Erich Leskly, but we have a number of different pieces that were donated by other survivors of Theresienstadt. And so these are some of the other artifacts that really give visitors and students a historical context of Theresienstadt. And so Christie, what do you have to show us right now?
Yeah, so I have some of the artifacts in front of me. So like you mentioned before, Jordanna, there was fake money that was actually distributed to the prisoners in the ghetto, which you can see in that middle image, but here is kind of a close-up of it. So you can see this is a 10 note, and you can see it's got the image of, I guess, a Jewish man holding the tablets of Moses in the corner there. And the money was basically made and distributed among the ghetto, but was essentially worthless, particularly outside the ghetto. It really wasn't worth anything.
So in a way, a level of that propaganda and the deception that they were being moved to an actual location.
Yeah.
And so what are some of the other artifacts that we're looking at the screen?
So in the top of the screen there is actually a deportation notice in a different collection within the museum for a lady by the name of Adele Cohen. And you're looking at Adele's deportation notice to let her know the time and the date that she was to report to be deported. And basically, we also, that one's quite fragile. This one is also fragile, but we also have one which was for Joanna Cohen, which was her sister. So we have both of those within the collection within the museum. And then, sorry.
I was going to ask you what the other piece of paper was that we're looking at.
Yeah, so the other piece of paper there is a ration card, which I don't happen to have right in front of me at this moment, but it's a ration card that was actually issued to the prisoners within Theresienstadt. Again, it's in a way part of that kind of deception and propaganda that was really common with the Nazis and to Theresienstadt, because as we know, the food within the camps and within the ghettos was very scarce, and basically people were starving. So it's a little bit laughable that they were given ration cards for rations and supplies.
In that last photograph, it looks like there are children playing. And
Yeah.
this is a still from the propaganda film that the Red Cross and the Nazis took during the Red Cross visit. And Leskly does depict the beautification of Theresienstadt for the Red Cross visit, but we will get to it. I'll just share a little bit quickly now so then we can really focus on this incredible artwork. In June of 1944, under the pressure of the Danish government, the Nazis permitted a small group from the International Red Cross and also the Danish Red Cross, and they were allowed to visit Theresienstadt for 6 hours. In preparation for the visit, elaborate measures were taken to beautify the camp. The SS authorities intensified deportation to alleviate overcrowding, so it didn't look like people were living in really inhumane conditions. False gardens, false cafes were set up. The barracks were painted, flower gardens were planted, and one prisoner mentioned that all the Red Cross officials needed to do was walk up and try to turn on one of the water taps, and they would see that this was all a farce. They also built theaters and fake cafes, and the prisoners were given strict instructions on how to behave and what to say if they were asked any questions. And through this, the Nazis successfully concealed the murderous reality of the life in Theresienstadt from the visiting Red Cross delegation, and they reassured the international world, those people who were concerned about Nazi treatment of European Jews. However, the truth was that Theresienstadt was a collection center for the deportation to killing centers in the East and was a place where people were tortured and starved and murdered. And that is what the photograph is. It's from this propaganda film that was made when the Red Cross visited, showing children enjoying a daily game in Theresienstadt. So here we have some of Leskly's artwork, and it pertains to the theme of conditions in the camp. So there was, as I mentioned, rampant starvation, food was a commodity, disease and overcrowding. These are all featured in these artworks. So I'm just gonna grab my little annotator, which I discovered today. So in this top photo or painting here, this is showing actually, Christie, can you tell us a little bit about this painting? Because I know it's behind, the original might be behind you.
So
before I dive into it.
Yeah, so the one that you're looking at on the screen is actually the reproduction that was created later by Leskly when he was living in Israel. So the one that is behind me, which I'm not sure how well you can see it, so I'm just going to hold it a little bit closer. And this is kind of a good example as well of what Jordanna was talking about before, that you can really see the cut marks in this one where it has been taken apart. And also you can see by looking at the larger scale reproduction has a lot of text, where in the piece that was created in the ghetto, all the text has been cut out. And actually probably just to backpedal a little bit and give some context on that as well, when we were talking about it before, I guess we mentioned that Leskly, did actually cut his artwork into pieces for fear of being discovered. But I also just kind of wanted to contextualize a little bit because it's definitely an important piece of the story where there was other prisoners that were obviously making artwork in the ghetto as well. And there was one particular group of prominent artists that were actually found out, discovered, arrested by the Gestapo and tortured and questioned, interrogated until they were ultimately sent to Auschwitz. And I think only one of the four of them survived. And so we think that it's likely that Leskly heard about this incident, and that was the driving factor for him to actually cut up his artwork, because he was fearful for his life and for his wife Elsa's life as well. And so they cut up the pieces and actually hid them in the floorboards. Well, Elsa actually took them and hid them in the floorboards of her barrack, and they were able to retrieve them again after the war, which is why we're able to look at them today, which is great. So that's just a little bit of background with. But yeah, so basically this image that we're looking at is called Doctors Are Hungry Too. And basically what it is depicting is, you can see there's the doctor that's standing at the door, and then there's a line of prisoners waiting to see the doctor, and basically the man that's second from the front, who is dressed in a cook's uniform, was a cook within Theresienstadt and is being given preferential treatment and sent right to the front of the line, because food was obviously a commodity in Theresienstadt because of the rampant starvation. People were starving, people didn't have food, and as a cook you had access to extra provisions, and doctors were in the same situation where they were also hungry. So you can see in the larger scale reproduction that the cook is holding a sack of food, possibly potatoes, behind his back, to give to the physician in exchange for his services.
Yeah, and I think that's really what Leskly is trying to depict here, is the fact that food was a powerful commodity. Not only was it rarely given, but the prisoners were forced to use it for perhaps seeing a doctor to save their lives. And this was a choice that they had to make every day. Was it to starve and perhaps receive medical attention, or was it to eat the food that they had and potentially die because of the lack of medical attention? And I want to point out in the artwork below, which is connected to this, this is speaking to the lack of food in the camp. And this is really, I think, one of my favorite examples of the satirical nature of some of Leskly's pieces, is because we see that he's using some sort of comical depiction to expose the true conditions in the camp. He's exaggerating the small size of the ladle that the women in the picture is using to serve out the rations, and it looks like just like little drips coming out of it. And he actually wrote on this piece that these were the additional rations for the hard labor workers. So this is what the additional rations looked like: this tiny little ladle with these tiny little drips of soup, depicting the bare minimum of food that was given to the prisoners in the camp. And this is really, I think, Christie used the word laughable. I think at the heart of a lot of these artistic depictions is Leskly is trying to bring humor into the pain and the suffering every day, and maintain his human dignity as somebody who wants to make jokes, who wants to make light of such a terrible situation. And these extra rations must have seemed like a mockery to the starving prisoners.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons, I think, too, why the collection is so unique, because a lot of the other artists at the time that have artwork that did survive Theresienstadt, so some of the other artists that I was mentioning before, the artwork that we see, it tends to depict like the very grim reality of the horrible things that were happening, and the horrible treatment that they were receiving from the Nazi guards and so on and so forth. But what Leskly is really trying to do, and is unique to his work, is he uses this form of satirical cartoon to really depict just everyday, even kind of mundane activities, and show normal ghetto life, essentially. And he is kind of quoted as saying that, I didn't want to waste my time crying over the monstrous behavior of the Nazi regime. Like, we knew that was the case, and I didn't want to waste my precious materials depicting the heroes of the ghetto. I just wanted to record the everyday activities. And he really, felt obligated to be able to express this indescribable horror in the language of like it's just absurd, the absurdity of what was going on around him, to really describe that, because he knew it so well.
Yeah, and so these other two images we see, the top painting is speaking to a disease that the prisoners jokingly referred to as Theresienka, which is a play on the word Terezin, or Theresienstadt, Terezin in Czech. And it's really speaking to the intense dysentery and typhus that were rampant in the camp, in this place where people were not given proper nutrition and forced to live in basically on top of one another in the stifling environment that's actually pictured in the painting below, which is Leskly illustrating his first night in the camp. There was intense disease that was really dysentery was rampant, and the prisoners themselves called it Theresienka, this sort of this disease that you could only get in Theresienstadt because of the inhumane conditions. And I see, Christie, you have the original behind you.
Yeah, so this is the picture that he created in the ghetto, and it's from his scrapbook. And so you can see, and you can also see in the picture on the screen, it's depicting a prisoner that is rushing down the stairs. This door in the background is the latrine, so he's rushing to try and make it to the latrine because paratyphoid was something that gave you severe diarrhea. And so, you know, the disease was, like Jordanna mentioned, it was so rampant that the prisoners dubbed it Theresienstadt because it was just so common, and basically everybody had it at some point because of the horrible conditions.
Can you hold up the drawing to the screen?
Yeah. Jeez.
And you mentioned this came from a notebook?
Yeah, so actually the original drawings were all part of a sketchbook that Leskly kept hidden during his time in the ghetto. And we actually, he cut them up and cut them into fragments, but we do still actually have the original cover of the notebook as well.
And so the painting below is what Leskly called his first night in the ghetto. And this really depicts, I think, the overcrowding. You can see there's clothing everywhere and there are people everywhere. And when Leskly actually arrived in Theresienstadt, he was already sick and had quite a high fever. And he was sent to the barracks where new transports were checked in and out and sort of examined for where they would be sent and what would be done to them. And there was extreme overcrowding, and he was unable to find a bed. So he just opens his one suitcase up and starts sorting through his possessions there on the floor in the midst of this very chaotic and crowded bunk of people who are oftentimes sick. And here he pictures himself on the floor, and there's this other figure, which is of a man in a white coat, kind of showing that perhaps he is a doctor. And the doctor is telling him that he needs vitamin P, and P means protection. And so basically saying that in Theresienstadt, it does not matter if somebody is sick or healthy or strong or weak, the privileges in the camp go the longest way. And I think this is another sort of dark satirical look at what the realities of Theresienstadt was like.
Yeah, and I actually have, so this is a really good example of what we were talking about before, that the reproductions are, you know, so much more detailed and so much more colorful. So we have the original drawing from the ghetto, and it's actually an unframed piece. So it's quite fragile, but I'm just going to hold it up so you can see. So you can see the difference between the original picture and what he was able to do with the limited materials that he had. And then the later Israel period piece just has so much more color and so much more detail. And really you feel that overcrowding of the barrack in the larger piece. But also you can see like Jordanna mentioned, the larger piece has a lot of text and other things that add to the satirical nature of what he's trying to depict. But obviously in the smaller one, all of those have been cut out, and you can see where the fragments have been taken apart too.
Yeah, and we can imagine that in Theresienstadt, he didn't have access to all of this color. And so he was able to reimagine his vision once he was free. And I'm sure also his state within the camp was very different from his state post-Holocaust, when he knows that he's free. His wife is also free. They've had 2 kids, and they've resettled in Israel, and they know that they are safe. And so I think that when you look at the 2 pieces juxtaposed, you actually can see sort of the growing of the artist and the growing in his security of knowing that he is in fact free, and he no longer needs to fear for his life. So next we're going to go to the next theme, which is cultural life in the ghetto. Of course, the artworks themselves are an example of cultural life, but Leskly actually depicted others around him. And so, Christie, what do you have behind you right now?
So the one picture behind me is one of the original pieces from the ghetto, and it's called The Ghetto Girl. And basically what it is depicting is Leskly depicts a scene from a musical that was written by one of the prisoners who was a composer before he was sent to Theresienstadt. And so it was called The Ghetto Girl, and the story is basically of a young ghetto guard who falls in love with a girl from the ghetto. And then there's musical notes in the larger scale piece. You can see there's musical notes in the background with the sheet music, with some of the song, the musical. And it's really interesting actually when you look, because the plot of the musical was supposed to be that it was 2 young people falling in love. But Leskly really contradicts this by depicting what appeared to be 2 elderly actors. who are playing the young couple, and then also showing the couple dancing in front of an entrance. So but to the left of the elderly lady, there's a small entranceway, and it's a little bit hard to see in the picture, but above that there is a sign that basically says hospital. So he's actually contradicting what the Ghetto Girl was actually about by showing this macabre sense of humor of having these two elderly people dancing in front of the entrance to the hospital. And then further to that as well, that we understand from later that it was actually revealed that the musical was actually written and performed in the ghetto after the Ghetto Guard had actually been disbanded and deported to the east to be killed. So there's that kind of really macabre sense of humor coming out there too.
And I would also add that during the visit of the Red Cross, oftentimes the Nazis had the prisoners of the camp perform performances and of music and plays for the visiting Red Cross, and actually would deport out the actors who were the prisoners. And so this speaks to me in a way of like having that door that leads to nowhere labeled hospital, that perhaps these actors were then performing and then being deported to the hospital, which was another way of saying to their death. I mean, as we know, because of Theresienstadt's unique place of being both a ghetto and a camp, and because so many renowned musicians and artists and intellectuals had been deported there, that there was a unique number of ways in which the camp was able to have cultural events flourish. There was a library in Theresienstadt, there was an archive in Theresienstadt, as well as in other ghettos. There were volumes of books and that people had smuggled in with their meager possessions. And so this is sort of the way that Leskly was, one, able to create the artwork, but two, also what he's depicting. And so this other painting that we see here is, I believe, of a real person. Is that right, Christie?
Yeah, so the person depicted in the picture, his name was Hambo, and he was actually quite a well-known, I guess, pop singer, musician of the time, before he was deported to Theresienstadt, and he became like a really beloved figure within Theresienstadt because he would perform his musical performances prior to being sent to the ghetto. Often it included an accordion or a violin. You can see him depicted here with his accordion and singing. And so he would put on these performances for the other prisoners in the camp, and actually in the smaller scale piece, which we unfortunately don't have at the moment, it's actually on exhibit at another museum right now. It actually depicts also an audience. So there's a number of heads around him, and he can be seen entertaining other prisoners within the ghetto.
And I see that he's singing a song in this. And what is the song that he's singing?
Yeah, so it actually translates to I am dying, tra-la-la, tra-la-la. Which again is a little bit of that satire and that kind of macabre sense of humor that Leskly displays in a lot of his pieces, because, I am dying is quite a somber tone. To add a tra-la-la at the end of it is quite a joyful wording to add to such a sad sentence.
And this is what's so incredible about having both the artist and the artwork survive, is that Leskly, in interviews following the Holocaust, spoke to the fact that this was a tune. It was kind of like a very happy tune that Hambo would sing, and the lyrics were I am dying, tra-la-la. And Leskly recalls that he himself would sometimes sing it in the camp, and that this was something like sort of an inside joke that the prisoners had that strengthened them and gave them resolve. And so he's been able to give us that extra layer of insight into the words that we see inscribed on this painting. And so then here we're going to take on the next theme, which is survival and resistance. And here are 3 paintings depicting that. Of course, there are many more themes within this collection. We have over 80 pieces in the collection, and that does not include some of the unframed illustrations that we have. And here, Christie, what did you just put up on the stand behind you?
Yeah, so the picture that we're looking at now is the one that you can see on the bottom right of your screen is the piece that was done in Israel. And then the piece behind me was the work that was done while Leslie was in the ghetto. And so, I think Jordanna kind of mentioned before that, merely to even just to survive in the face of such horrific conditions that these prisoners were facing was a resistance in its own right, really. And of course, Leslie being able to create these pieces as well is, resistance, an example of the incredible survival and strength and resistance of him within the ghetto as well. So this particular piece, Leslie depicts a lone ghetto guard and he's standing watch. He's wrapped in a warm clothing. It looks like a cold, windy day. And then the slogan on the Israel piece reads, "Security from deportation to Poland is not a free gift," which was actually a favorite saying of the commander of the ghetto guard, who was Dr. Karl Lowenstein. And he considered the fact that the position that these ghetto guards were given was basically a privilege that had to be earned by dedication and good performance, because they were basically protected from being deported east and where they would be killed, essentially. So you can see in the Israel piece, it has the text. And actually, this ghetto piece as well also has the text in it, and it's quite a complete piece. It's not actually cut up like some of the others.
And the movement in that piece is incredible. You can feel sort of the frigid winds blowing you around and knocking you down. I think like the movement is actually very incredible. And I mean, to even survive in these horrific conditions was on its own a form of resistance. And prisoners really did try to exhibit some sort of semblance of normalcy. I mean, if you look at the Holocaust as a process of dehumanization, every single step of the way, then any way that people maintained their human dignity was a way in which they were able to resist just a little bit. And so here in the next two images that we're going to see is exactly that, is exactly showing us this. And I think, I mean, again, these art pieces in themselves are an example of this humility and humanity and really human dignity, because Leskly quoted, I mean, a quote that Leskly said was, "For me to not paint would be not to live." And so he really felt that by painting in Theresienstadt, maybe one of the most inhumane places, he was able to live in that way. And so life in Theresienstadt was, of course, horrific, horrendous, murderous, but to use satire and humor in his art to depict what was going on around him was in itself a form of intellectual and spiritual resistance. And really, I think, was such an act of defiance. So this collection is just one of my favorite collections. I think it's incredibly unique in the sense that not very many collections from the Holocaust give us this depth of understanding of daily life and really demonstrate this intellectual and spiritual resistance. So I just kind of want to point to one of my personal favorites, which is the upper left-hand corner, where we see two, I'm going to guess women or children perhaps, sitting, and they're sitting in front of Shabbat candlesticks and a Hanukkah, a Hanukkah menorah. And that to me represents the fact that they are celebrating a Jewish holiday. And, you know, during the Holocaust, when they were being tortured and murdered for being Jewish, to maintain their Jewish religion in spite of that is something that's truly, I think, unbelievable. And it really honors the tradition and the heritage and Jewish identity of these people. And I just think this is such an interesting piece that shows the darkness all around the barracks, and then the light coming not just from the candlestick, but really from this place of the soul. The Hebrew word neshama, the soul of the people and the soul of the religion that is being clandestinely celebrated in this barrack. And then Christie, I know that you also love the lower painting, so I want you to describe why it resonates with you.
Yeah, so the lower painting is definitely one of my favorites. So it's called Smuggling Flowers into the Ghetto, and you can see in the image on the bottom left of the screen there, Leslie is depicting a young woman whose coat is marked by the yellow star, and also she's identified by the text on the wall behind her that she is an agricultural worker. And then under her coat, she's concealing, you can see a bunch of small flowers as she re-enters the ghetto. So she's actually going back into the ghetto, returning from working outside the ghetto in the plots of fruits and vegetables that were kept just outside the gates, which were grown by the prisoners for the Nazis to use, essentially. And so it's just something that's really kind of unique and original to me when I sort of looked at it in a little bit greater detail, because she's smuggling flowers into the ghetto. And so, something that is obviously forbidden because prisoners weren't able to have something as simple or like a simple nicety such as a flower in the ghetto. But prisoners did it just to be able to preserve that small ray of hope or sunshine in, the otherwise bleakness and darkness that was living under these conditions in Theresienstadt. And so it's really an example of them trying to, I guess, maintain their humanity in any way, shape or form that was possible.
And then here we're going to touch upon the Red Cross visit, which was such a unique, this didn't happen in any other ghetto or concentration camp throughout Europe. And the fact that Leskly depicted it is fairly incredible. And so I first want to talk about not the piece that Christie has behind her, but the other piece on the right-hand side, showing a man clutching his jaw in agony. Probably he has like a rotten tooth. There was not dental hygiene, of course, in Theresienstadt, and he's walking by a dentist's office. And you see there's a sign in the front window about, the dentist's office. And then if you look behind it, it's completely empty. And I think that this is such this work of satire, of making fun of these horrific, unimaginable situations, I think is remarkable of Leskly. And this advertisement in the dentist window is, it actually says on it, Leskly wrote on it, "Keep your mouth shut and teeth healthy," which of course all dentists say keep your teeth healthy. But keep your mouth shut is really because during the Red Cross visit, the Nazis had made it so clear to the prisoners that they needed to keep their mouth shut. They could not say what the truth was. They could not tip off any of the Red Cross visitors in any sort of way. That they had to actually keep their mouth shut. And I think that also adding to the irony is that the image depicts this perfect set of teeth next to a toothbrush and toothpaste, that items that were not available in Theresienstadt. And this man is holding his mouth. Maybe he had been punched in the face when he was being tortured. Maybe his teeth were rotting, but he's forced to walk by this dentist office because whether or not the Nazis pretended to the Red Cross in the outside world that a dentist office existed, it definitely did not, and he could not receive any sort of medical attention that he needed. And so the other one, all sidewalks will be scrubbed. I know Christie's behind you. Can we see it in a little bit closer? And tell us about this piece.
Yeah, so this one as well is part of the series of paintings that Leskly did about the Red Cross visit. And obviously it's depicting a woman who is being made to scrub the sidewalk. And the text behind her says all sidewalks will be scrubbed. And basically the prisoners were instructed to scrub the path or the areas that the Red Cross were going to basically traverse. And so they were scrubbing those paths to make sure that they were clean and everything looked up to scratch, basically, to really continue to perpetuate this whole propaganda that the Theresienstadt ghetto was this model ghetto or this spa town, as Jordanna mentioned before. And then you can also see in the background of the larger piece, there's a poster on the right-hand side, and that actually says, talking about a big sports festival that was going to take place with soccer matches and athletics, dances, games, and so on, which is, obviously, again, part of the farce, because none of those things really did happen. There was none of that, but it was specifically put in place for the benefit of the Red Cross that was visiting.
Yeah, just the irony of a dentist's office or cleaning the streets in a place like Theresienstadt. It's not lost on me. And so here are some examples of additional unframed work. So as Christie mentioned, actually a large piece of our collection currently is on exhibit in another institution. But we do have, in addition to our framed pieces, we also have these unframed works that are fragmented and don't always have a narrative that Leskly has spoken to, or are not part of his recreations. And they might have been just sketches he did in the camp, or practice sketches until he completed his finished work, or something that he might have just abandoned in the beginning. And so I know Christie also mentioned earlier that all of these had been in a sketchbook. And here on the left-hand side of our screen, we actually see that photograph of what the sketchbook looks like. And Christie is holding the actual sketchbook from Theresienstadt, just to think about what happened around this artifact, that Leskly held this notebook in Theresienstadt as people were being tortured and murdered and dehumanization for years. And it survived all of that. And now it's in Christie's hands is absolutely, I mean, it's unbelievable to think about the things that this scrapbook could say if it could speak. And it's a really precious piece of this collection.
Yeah, and you see, like Jordanna mentioned, we definitely do have some unframed pieces. And actually, it's really interesting things that I kind of discovered upon looking at some of these pieces in greater detail is that clearly some of these people that are depicted in some of these pictures were like preparation sketches that maybe Leskly had done in preparation for a larger work, because you see that some of these people appear in the faces in some of the within his body of work. And then just specifically to mention the pictures along the bottom there, these are part of a, like I mentioned, they were, I guess, preparation sketches, but they actually ended up appearing in a work titled Six Friends from Commando Zossen. And basically we know from Leskly's family that he was taken towards the end of the war. He was taken with a number of other men to a labor camp on the outskirts of Berlin. And the group was tasked with building a secret living quarters deep in the forest for senior Nazi officials. And it was towards the end of the war when things weren't looking very good for Nazi Germany. And so it was intended to be like a secret bunker, I guess, for senior Nazi officials. And so Leskly's family actually learned the details of some of this part of his history from the diary of another prisoner who was within that group. After the task was completed, the group of 10 men were actually put onto a train with hundreds of other prisoners, and something that we hear about quite a lot. They were given no food, no water for 10 days, with the exception of a small piece of salami that was given to them to basically share amongst all of them. On the 10th day, they arrived back extremely weak, malnourished, practically unconscious. And it was something that Leskly never really spoke about in his testimony. His family talk about how he didn't talk about it with them at all, and they discovered further details about this part of his history from another prisoner's diary. And so the pictures that you see in the bottom of the screen there, and we have copies of some of the images within the collection, are actually the profiles of other men that were among the group of prisoners that were on that task force with him, and that were in the train car with him. So he actually was still drawing even when he was taken with a small group of other prisoners to a different area. On the train, he was still managing to create sketches and still trying to record what he was seeing. And obviously it wasn't even something that he could really talk about. So this was the way that he was able to kind of express that, because it was something that he took with him to his grave.
Yeah, I mean, I see that he wrote their names and where they were from is just a testament that these people existed. And even though they may not have been able to live, Leskly's artwork gave them voice and acts as a memorial to honor and commemorate their lives and give face to them, that these were actual human beings who were murdered during the Holocaust. So I think another layer of Leskly's artwork is just that, is it gives voice to those who were unable to have a voice following the war. So I just, thank you so much, Christie, for showing us some of that artwork. Thank you everyone for being with us today. I want to open it up to some questions. And I know we have a few already. I see that Paulette asked, since Prague was part of the Nazi-occupied areas, how did Leskly's relocation to Prague help him escape the Nazi invasion? So it's not so much that he believed when he went to Prague that he was escaping the Nazi invasion, because both where he was situated and Prague were under the Nazis' control. It was more this hope and belief that he would have more access to work in Prague, that there would have been some maybe under the table jobs that he would be able to make some money from. Whereas in the small city that he was in, it was probably unrealistic, because most people would know that he was maybe Jewish there, or there just weren't as many opportunities. But just a big city like Prague offered more connections and opportunities, which is most likely why they went there after the invasion. And then how did he rescue his art from the camp? He and his wife, like Christie said earlier, there was this purge of artists. And so Leskly was afraid of his artwork being discovered. And so he cut up his artwork into small pieces, and his wife took them to her barrack and she hid them beneath the floorboards, and they both survived. And so retrieved this artwork following the war. And did he interact with the children whose art we've seen? So this is a great question. There's a very, very famous published book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly, and it's a collection of artwork and poems written and drawn by children who were in Theresienstadt, for the most part perished. And this collection was saved, remained in Theresienstadt. It was found afterwards. For the most part, no, most likely he did not have a lot of interaction with the kids. Theresienstadt did have, of course, children prisoners, but they were kept primarily separate from the adults, because the adults engaged in a lot of forced and slave labor, and the children less so in the same sort of forced, or they all were also in forced labor, but not the same type of forced labor that the adults were in. Additionally, another process of dehumanization is breaking up families. And so the Nazis would break apart families when they arrived in Theresienstadt and sending the children to one area and the adults to another. So although they might have had some contact, it would have been limited for the most part. It wouldn't have been as if they were creating art together, because all of this was really clandestine. And then did his wife survive? Yes, she did survive. They, of course, reunited after the war, and and there they are. And they had 2 children following the war and moved to Israel. I know, Christie, don't you have another great photo of them in front of a red wall?
I do. Hang on, let me just pull it up right here. So these photos are from 1983, and when they were living in Israel.
Yeah, so they luckily were able to both survive. He did not come to America. He remained in Israel. And the collection came to us sort of through a third party that had, so he worked as an artist after the Holocaust in Israel, and his artwork for the majority was sold there. He also had non-Holocaust art pieces, but this collection of Holocaust art was purchased by another person, who then ultimately donated it to the Holocaust Museum here in LA. And the way that he placed the artwork better together, actually Christie can show us the piece behind her. So Susan's asking how the art was placed back together. And here you can actually see the tape running down the middle of the painting. And so it's like a jigsaw, like he took the pieces and he taped them back together, which we do not recommend putting tape on any of your primary sources at home. But this is how he stitched them back, and then he recreated them later on in his life. And so, yeah, I mean, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We've already reached 5 o'clock, which is very exciting. And thank you all for joining us on our second installment of Inside the Acid-Free Box. I hope that you've enjoyed this look into one of our precious collections, and thank you for joining me and Christie. If you're interested in joining us again, we do have a third installment in November. November. I'm like, what month is, I don't even know what month we're in anymore. So if somebody wants to help me figure out how to keep that better track of the time, please let us know how I can do that. So we'll be having another one in November, which we'll be looking at a really cool collection of a survivor named Edith Flagg. Some of you might know her from the Bravo TV show, where she appeared before she sadly passed away with her grandson, Josh Flagg. And we were entrusted with a huge collection of her artifacts and experiences from the Holocaust, which we will be sharing with you. Most of them are in this locked archive, so this is your only chance to see these artifacts. So I hope you'll join us for that. We also tomorrow are hosting our live stream special. It's a 45-minute live stream in which we'll hear from celebrities like Billy Crystal and Henry Winkler and Ben Stiller and Tiffany Haddish and Gal Gadot, who will speak about the importance of Holocaust education in today's world and all of the incredible work that Holocaust Museum LA does to educate our city, our community, our country, and the world. And so we will hope that you'll be joining us for that. We have, as many of you know, dozens and dozens of great virtual programming available. If you've missed any of our programming, please visit our YouTube page by searching Holocaust Museum LA, and you can subscribe to our page. Please check out our website, holocaustmuseumla.org, and stay in touch, and we hope to see you again soon. Anything that you want to add, Christy?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, great. Everyone have a safe and healthy evening, and we will see you again.